We're almost ready. So if you've got last minute things to get ready, yeah. So this is your 20-second notice. Not warning. 20-second notice. We will be beginning shortly. So yeah, and there's spaces in front, so do come. That's good. Thank you so much. There are seats right there, right in front. Yeah. There's a square right there. Okay, I think everyone's got a seat. Just to say that this was always a very, very highly subscribed and oversubscribed event. So, you know, I'm not surprised that we have some seats which, or maybe no seats at all left, but okay. I'm going to let Nia and Annie deal with them, with people as they come in, or get them seated. So hello, and very warm welcome to the book launch of Professor Shirin's much awaited and anticipated book, Depletion. My name is Sumi, and I'm a professor of political theory and gender studies, and also the head of department of gender studies here at the LSE, and I shall be chairing this book launch this evening. This evening's program is brought to you by the Department of Gender Studies and the LSE Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity. And I want to extend actually a big thank you to Professor Choong, who sat right here, who's the director of the LSE Atlantic Fellows program, for being such a wonderful co-host for the book launch. So I'm really delighted to see you all at this evening's celebratory event. As you can see, we have a full house, and that's always wonderful. We have a packed, so not only do we have a full house, we also have a packed agenda this evening, and let me just go over this evening's order of events. I will first introduce the panelists who will comment on the book, and also then I will also introduce the book's author. And after I have introduced them, Professor Rai will speak on the main themes of the book for 10 minutes. This will be followed by each of the panelists who will present their thoughts on the book, with each panelist also speaking for 10 minutes. Shirin then will have 5 minutes or so to respond to any questions, comments, by the panelists. And then, of course, it will be all over to you. We have about 30 minutes of audience Q&A, and so that's your chance to ask Professor Rai questions that you might have about her book. So I'll now introduce the speakers in the order that they will speak. Diane Elson, to my extreme right, is emeritus professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Essex. In 2016, she was awarded the Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought, and in 2018, the International Book Prize, the Japan Society of Political Economy. Professor Elson has served as a member of the UN Committee for Development Policy and as a consultant to UN Women. She has also been vice president of the International Association for Feminist Economics. Her recent co-edited books include Harvesting Feminist Knowledge for Public Policy, Human Rights and the Capabilities Approach, Financial Governance from a Feminist Perspective, and Rethinking Economics for Social Justice, the Radical Potential of Human Rights, which she has co-authored with R. Balakrishnan and J. Hines. Juanita Elias, right next to me, is Professor of International Political Economy in the Department of Politics and International Studies at the University of Warwick. Her most recent book publications are IP, International Political Economy of Everyday Life, co-authored with James Brassett, Lena Riethel, and Ben Richardson, and Gender Politics and the Pursuit of Competitiveness in Malaysia. She is Vice Chair of the British International Studies Association and an editor at Review of International Political Economy. Ania Plomien, who many of you know, because of course you are going to be taught by her this term, is Associate Professor in Gender and Social Science and Deputy Head of Department of Research at the LSE Department of Gender Studies. And also Deputy Director of the Research Program on Gender Justice and the Wellbeing Economy. Her feminist political economy research centers on the problem of globalization of the state and the crisis of social reproduction in Europe, in particular via market reach into care, food and housing provisioning and associated gendered harms. She is the co-author of Gender Migration and Domestic Work, Masculinities, Male Labour and Fathering in the UK and USA, and the co-editor of the Sage Handbook of Feminist Theory. Christopher Choong is a PhD candidate at the University of Warwick and a recipient of the Chancellor's International Scholarship. He is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Fellows for Social and Economic Equity at the International Inequalities Institute at the London School of Economics, and also the Deputy Director of Research at the Khazanah Research Institute in Malaysia. He was previously economist and program manager for the UNDP Country Office of Malaysia, Singapore, and Brunei Darussalam. And now I'm going to turn left to the book's author. Shirin is Distinguished Research Professor in the Department of Politics and International Studies, School of Oriental and African Studies, and also a Fellow of the British Academy. Her research interests are in the field of political economy of development, gender and political institutions, and performance and politics. Her recent books include the Oxford Handbook of Politics and Performance and Performing Representation, Women Members in the Indian Parliament. Her latest book, for which we're all here to launch, is called Depletion, The Human Costs of Caring, and explores the multiple facets of social reproductive work and argues that its undervaluing depletes those who perform this work. Struggles to reverse depletion, Shirin argues, are struggles for a good life, generative of new imaginings of how this work of care, both draining and joyful, can be reorganized. So, I'll give you Professor Shirin.
Thank you, Sumi, for your generous introduction, but also for organizing this event. Thanks also to Nelly, who have been sort of, asking completely crazy questions which she possibly couldn't answer. Thank you also, of course, to the panelists who are here to engage with the book, and to all of you for turning up today. I also want to say thank you to my family, my extended family sitting out there. They have never heard me speak, or very rarely, so this is a very, very special occasion for me. So, in New Delhi, 8 women lead different lives, going about their everyday life work and experience the relentlessness of their social reproductive labor. In Coventry, children look after parents and grandparents who are differently abled or are sick. The Amdiba community in Eastern Cape, South Africa, worries about the mining company that is about to destroy their way of life. These are some of the stories of depletion of individuals, households, and communities discussed in the book. How can we understand depletion? In the original paper that built on Diane Elson's work, her report in 2000, my colleagues Catherine Hoskins and Dania Thomas and I defined depletion as follows. Depletion results when the outflow of social reproductive labor, time, energy, effort, lack of sleep, and rest, for example, exceeds the inflow of resources, good food, adequate shelter, rest, and sleep, for instance, tipping those affected over the threshold of sustainability. So how long can you do this work and at what cost? Consent does not mitigate depletion, just as love does not make social reproduction less depleting. Depletion through social reproduction is a concept that also bridges the world of paid and unpaid labor. depletion through paid work is affected by the unpaid work that is done in the home and not counted, and vice versa. Why does depletion matter? Our lives and the lives of future generations are dependent on the work that we call social reproduction, the reproduction of life itself, which can be and is being eroded through this depletion. The argument at the heart of this book is as follows. Reproduction of life doesn't just happen. It is labored over in different contexts and with differential resources unequally. In all countries, in all classes, races, religions, and cultures, women perform these labors more than men. But these women are also classed and raced and located in deeply unequal ways, and therefore experience depletion differently, intersectionally. Women who cope with this work in the context of poverty and of violence are constantly told that their everyday labor, both paid and unpaid, to maintain the rhythms of life do not count in or as production or don't count as much. And yet, we rely on this work every day and know that without this work, we will not survive as a global population, culture, and community. The denial of this work is institutionalized through our methodologies of accounting for work, through our ideological positioning of domestic work, through cultural and social gender norms. The exploitation of this work of life-giving and its maintenance depletes and generates crises of care that threaten not just livelihoods, but lives. Fundamentally, we continue to take this work for granted as given and costless, even as the costs of social reproduction mount up. So what does the depletion lens allow us to recognize, assess, measure, and address? First, the unequal distribution of social reproduction that leads to depletion harms those who care. So harm is a central concept in the book and also in the framework. This harm through depletion is multifaceted to physical and mental health, through discursive violence, as well as to citizenship entitlements, and affects everyone engaged in social reproduction, but as I've already said, it affects them unequally. Harm can be felt at different levels, individual, household, and community, which are codependent and co-constitutive. Holding harm central to this debate is important because it reveals the multifaceted nature of depletion, the ripple effects of harm, and the urgency to reverse them. Second, the strategies of reversing harm, what we called in that paper, and I keep in the book, mitigation, replenishment, and transformation, cannot be successful if society as a whole, states, markets, individuals, non-state and collective actors, do not acknowledge this harm in measurable ways. Further, individual strategies of mitigating harm and reversing depletion can only be limited, unequal, and indeed can intensify harm for others. Think about people who actually, whose labor is bought in, right? And so who looks after their social reproductive labors. State intervention in addressing the unequal distribution of social reproductive work is therefore essential, if not sufficient, for replenishment as a strategy of reversal of harm. Third, and I think Sumi referred to it, a transformative vision of a good life for all rather than just for some must include, I argue in the book, human as well as planetary care. Depletion of our environment is entangled with capitalism's pursuit of cheap labor, as Jason Moore has called it, and harms us and future generations. Fourth, and finally, the book is focused on the recognition of depletion as harm and why it must recognize the location and histories of inequality that cast long shadows on the current care regimes. Race, gender, and class are vectors of this inequality. Through focusing on depletion, then, we can begin to reveal the full costs of social reproduction, to understand the circuits of power that circulate through regimes of care and how these might be challenged and reversed. In essence, depletion fundamentally affects the material conditions of reproduction and maintenance of social life, and the struggles for reversing depletion can therefore help us think through the transformation of social reproduction itself. The struggles to reverse depletion that I cover in the book take different forms through individual attempts to develop networks of friendships or laments against not being able to do so, depending upon extended family networks, through strategies of self-care where possible, and through challenging and holding the state accountable through political mobilizations. Reversing depletion is, however, not easy. Depletion is anchored in structural inequalities, which are essential to the reproduction of capitalist social relations. State policy to address issues of social provisioning and welfare builds on the state's unique legal and sanctioning power regarding production and management of gendered and racialized category, as V. Spike Peterson has also mentioned in her book, and of gendered and minoritized groups. This, in turn, is generative of intended and unintended, differentiated, discriminatory practices, policies, and outcomes. In all these struggles, therefore, location matters. Standing in one place rather than another, whether it is along the boundary of class or race, caste or sexuality, of formal and informal work, of waged and unwaged labor, provides vistas and possibilities of social reproduction and depletion that converge as well as diverge. I would suggest that depletion as a concept also decenters. Focusing on the costs of social reproduction allows for light to be cast on relationships that invoke love as well as pain, joy as well as exhaustion, solidarity as well as exploitation. Finally, depletion intensifies under conditions of crises as everyday resourcing of life becomes difficult and the social infrastructure is undermined. Diane has worked, as has Women's Budget Group, on, for example, austerity and its impact on social reproduction. However, I would also like to note that if depletion can be read as structural violence, under the current conditions of unparalleled, unremitting, and indiscriminatory bombing of Gaza and now Lebanon, leading to mass killing and displacement, the reproduction and maintenance of life becomes almost impossible. We are witnessing not depletion, but rather near total collapse of social reproduction. And I think I want to just say that and acknowledge it because I feel almost that depletion as a framework doesn't quite capture the scale and intensity of this violence that we are witnessing. As you can tell, depletion is not a cheery or an optimistic concept. However, as I look back to the life stories of individuals, households, and communities covered in this book, I find much to be hopeful about as well. This is because despite the challenges of un- or mal-recognized social reproductive work, despite balancing care work with paid work under conditions of class disprivilege, we find individuals, households, and communities struggling against the structures of everyday exploitation, imagining different lives and coming together in friendship and solidarity to try and reverse their own and their community's depletion, present as well as anticipated. In writing this book, I had two objectives. First, mapping and revealing the intensity and extensity of the problem of depletion, and second, to examine and reflect on how it affects our ecologies at individual, household, and community levels, and how struggles to reverse it are taking place in different modes and at different levels. The book, then, is a plea to recognize the costs of social reproduction and to stop the harm to these ecologies of life-making and its flourishing through mobilizations of new imaginaries and activism that are both reflexive and sustainable. Reversing depletion is urgent and demands a solidaristic and transformative approach to world-making. Thank you.
Shirin. Yes, Diane.
Shirin, I'm delighted to help launch this important and timely book. Many congratulations for bringing this research to fruition. You and I have talked about these issues over the years, and it's wonderful now to see the book is actually here. And as Shirin mentions in the book's introduction, and as she said, I raised the issue of depletion in a report in 2000 that I organised for UNIFAM on progress of the world's women. And I connected it to overwork, a combination of long hours of paid and unpaid work, but I never had time to explore the idea in depth or conduct any case studies about its occurrence, although I did briefly revisit the idea in a contribution to a book in 2012 that UNRWA had organised on recovery after the financial crisis, and I raised the issue, is there going to be recovery for some, but continuing depletion for others? So I'm really pleased to see that Shirin has taken forward the issue of depletion and has written this book that covers both conceptual and empirical issues. I think this book is particularly timely because we are beginning to have some success in getting economists, statisticians and policymakers to recognise the importance of unpaid care and domestic work in discussions of statistics and of public policy, nationally, internationally, different kind of research areas. But while the economic contribution of this work, this unpaid care and domestic work, is increasingly recognised, the costs of it to those who do the work are not. And Shirin's book highlights these costs with a particular focus on the costs of caring. Her richly detailed case studies vividly show how stress, anxiety and tiredness diminish the well-being of those with insufficient respite from care, depleting their health and strength. Shirin does not make a false opposition between individuals exercising agency and experiencing harm. It's not, I've argued for a long time, it's never one or the other, and I'm pleased to see that Shirin has used this framework too. As her case studies show, both can happen at the same time. The agency of those with substantial care responsibilities, the agency they're able to exercise as individuals, is not broad enough nor deep enough to prevent depletion, although it may be enough to mitigate some harms and secure survival. They may cope, I think this comes through in the case studies, they may cope, but at the sacrifice of important aspects of well-being. So I think this is really, really important, the point that we should all be making. Yes, research community, policymakers, governments, statisticians, you've gone a little way towards meeting our demands that you recognise unpaid care and domestic work, but what you haven't recognised is the cost to those who are doing it. Shirin rightly considers the quantitative as well as qualitative evidence. She knows I'm going to make this point, so I'm not sure she's going to agree with me, but we can perhaps take it up in discussion. But I think that the evidence in her book shows the limitations of campaigning that many feminists have engaged in to include unpaid work in the gross domestic product by attaching a monetary value to unpaid care and domestic work. If we did this, and there are various exercises by statistical agencies and by researchers to do that, it would increase the size of the economy's output, but it would take no account of the depletion of human capacities, of health, both mental and physical, of ability to exercise choice and participate in the life of the community. And I've come to feel that including a monetary value of unpaid care and domestic work in the gross domestic product would mirror the existing misdirections of including in the GDP the output of polluting industries without deducting the costs of pollution, the output of industries that degrade land without deducting the costs of reproduction. And Shirin in her book does make links between the issues of care for people and care for the environment. And I think this is an important point to hold on to. We have to be careful that we don't add things to the GDP without taking account of the cost of those things. And insofar as a higher GDP is considered better than lower, as of course the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves, keeps telling us, what we need is more growth. More growth if we add unpaid work to the GDP. But that would imply that more unpaid care and domestic work is better than less. Whereas in fact many of us have been campaigning to reduce certain aspects of this unpaid care and domestic work, particularly the depleting aspects that Shirin brings out in her book. So I think it's preferable to show the monetary value of output produced by unpaid work in another strategy that Shirin mentions in her book, which is constructing household satellite accounts that can show monetary value of paid and unpaid work, unpaid work in households, dividing it in terms of what men do, what women do, relating it to the class position of households, different types of households. These accounts, as they stand at the moment, do not make depletion visible, but I think it might be possible to extend them in various ways. And Shirin's thinking a little bit along those lines, I think, in her attempt to develop a quantitative framework for looking at depletion in chapter 2 of her book. I'm not totally convinced by the way she does it at the moment, but I think the underlying ideas are worth developing. I look forward to more conversations with Shirin on this. And in the short run, if we're still talking about quantitative data, I prioritise the further development of time use surveys. Shirin discusses time use surveys in the book, and they provide evidence of both the extent of work paid and unpaid, and they can bring the costs, including depletion, explicitly into the framework. They already can reveal who works long hours, including travel to work, which Shirin takes up in chapter 4 of her book, and has the least leisure, lack of time for rest, I think is an important aspect of depletion, which time use studies will show you. In the past, time use studies have not been very good at capturing the intensity of work, which is another aspect of depletion, because they only allow you to say you're doing one thing at a time. And we all know one of the problems about depletion is when you're juggling with many things at a time. But the latest developments in time use surveys allow you to record at least 3 activities. So you're cooking the dinner, you're taking care of the baby, and you're listening out for the children playing outside. Or you're listening out for your elderly mother who's in another room in the house. And I think that extension means we can get a little bit more of the flavour of the intensity of work, and that's very important for thinking about depletion, I think. And time diaries can now be collected via apps on mobile phones, so that makes it easier to do. But I think the important extension we also need is in a study that Shirin cites, taken in Canada, where the time use data was linked to health data. So then you could look and see who's working these very long hours, very intense work, what is it doing to their health? And I think that link to health data is really important. And I think Shirin could extend her analysis a bit by showing how these costs are frequently not just personal to the people doing the care work, they have knock-on effects on the wider society and the economy. Take the case of the child carers considered in chapter 5 of her book. If the child carers are not supported and given respite, their education is jeopardised, weakening their future earnings and their productivity. Their own health, physical and mental, is compromised. Their own demands for health services are likely to increase. If they suffer too much depletion, in fact, they'll be unable to provide care for family members. And failing to provide public services to support the child carers is in fact a false economy, because it reduces immediate costs for the social care budget, but it pushes them elsewhere, depleting the future as Shirin writes, and I think that's a really important point. So my final point that I wanted to make, Shirin considers how depletion might not just be mitigated but reversed, and I like the way she couches this in terms not just of specific policies, although that's important, but in terms of solidaristic struggles for transformation. She writes that processes of communication are important, not just for building solidarities, but also for maintaining them. Her book itself is a process of communication, and it does use two different languages. The language of care, which is highlighted in the title and in many aspects of the book, and the language of social reproduction, which she used a lot in her presentation here. So I'd like to end my comments by asking Shirin to reflect, and for us all to reflect, on the strengths and weaknesses of each of these languages, the language of care, the language of social reproduction, if what we want to do is build solidaristic studies. But thank you, Shirin, for this great book.
Anita.
Thank you. So I'd just like to start by saying congratulations to Shirin on the publication of your book. And it's just really exciting to be here this evening to reflect on this book. And as a sadly former colleague from Warwick University, I've watched this book really develop over the years, reading early versions of the AFJP paper, and then seeing the book develop through a range of very different and diverse projects, workshops and publications. And if you read the book, you'll get a real sense of the real kind of breadth of Shirin's work and the wide range of different studies that she's been involved in and invested in over the years. Some of these I've been involved in, and some of these other people here today have been involved in as well. So reading this book, then it feels quite familiar because I see on the page ideas that Shirin has raised in conversations again and again, and most importantly, her work on depletion has been so central to work that we've undertaken together on caring and carers in the UK, and on our feminist theorisation of the everyday and in ongoing work. During this time, I've seen depletion as a concept become more tangible. Firstly, it's in the sense that it's something that can be used to challenge policy paradigms. What are the political consequences of not investing in care infrastructures, for example? How might systems of schooling or public transportation provision be reshaped in ways that can mitigate depletion? Secondly, as you see in the book, it's a concept that yields important methodological insights and reflections on how we do research. Diane has already talked a lot about the discussion in the book around kind of quantitative approaches, but also the book talks a lot about qualitative methods, shadowing people, understanding their daily rhythms and routines through the tool that Shirin has developed called the Feminist Everyday Observatory Tool, FEOT. And finally, I've seen the concept of depletion continue to make important theoretical insights, challenging scholars in my field of international political economy to better connect their work to gender, to the everyday, to care, and to consider the very real costs of failing to recognise care. So the first thing I want to touch on in my comments is what I see as the contribution of the concept of depletion. It's a concept that matters for feminist scholarship and for political economy more broadly. Its contribution lies in identifying how gendered injustices rooted in the unequal distribution of social reproductive labour creates very real forms of harm. Through reading a page of the book, we see and understand the very real consequences of the non-recognition of social reproduction and how this is experienced by individuals, households and communities. Depletion then matters as a concept because it gives a name to something that is so utterly normalised, so invisible, the exhaustion of undertaking work so completely unrecognised and certainly not valued. And the term depletion is so apt because it recognises the extractive nature of care labour at an individual, household and community level, and pushes us to disentangle understandings of care from its all-encompassing kind of ideological and cultural baggage. And this matters because the work of caring is always entangled with ideas of the labour of love, altruism, resilience and heroic coping under pressure. Remember, clap for carers, for example. In her analysis of household labour among women in New Delhi, Shirin's work instead highlights the moments of stress and exhaustion, and we're continually reminded that these experiences are so invisible and so easily naturalised, and as one respondent commented, make a hobby out of housework because you have to do it anyway. This ideological baggage makes it hard to recognise the costs, burdens and harms of social reproductive labour, consequences that are so easily dismissed through ideas of the bad parent, the dysfunctional or problem family, or even spendthrift local councils who've been crippled by the rising cost of social care and special educational provision. Invariably then, household labour comes to be quite central to Shirin's analysis of depletion, but she continually reminds us that this is not the exclusive site within which depletion occurs. So she looks at the daily commute, for example, and how this is experienced, and also looks at groups who are not women who experience depletion, in particular in relation to the chapter on child carers. And for me, it was these chapters on everyday lives in New Delhi and child carers that were really standout chapters for me in terms of illustrating what the concept of depletion is capable of doing and showing. And I also like these chapters because they connect so comprehensively with work that we've done on the everyday, delving into everyday lives and sharing the voices and stories of the respondents. In the chapter on women's household labour in New Delhi, and the temporalities and rhythms of daily life are brought into focus, moving beyond mere time use that can simply be recorded in some kind of time use diary, and highlighting the thoughts and feelings of the respondents as well as their limited strategies for replenishment and mitigation. And this is how and she talks about how respondents are negotiating life, how their lives are framed by unequal and burdensome gender regimes, but they negotiate this actively, thoughtfully, and with awareness of their own positionality. In the chapter on child carers, I actually love this because it's just so nice to see Coventry kids having a voice in the pages of a feminist ID book. So it's kind of special in that way. But also through a focus on children, the nature of depletion comes to be understood in very different ways in relation to worries about school and future, childhoods unnecessarily lost to caring, and seeing this as a form of injustice. And of course, there's a really interesting discussion there of the role of the child carers charity that has sought to articulate more transformative and broader notions of care and caring that enable wider recognition of the costs of caring. And one thing that I thought was quite nice in this chapter was where you talked about the school as a site of depletion and how the kind of restrictive nature of the school day and school rules serves to kind of intensify the depletion that child carers face. And I felt that we could extend this to the university. And so, you know, one of the things that a lot of my students talked to me about during the pandemic was the caring responsibilities that they had taken on, particularly in terms of supervising younger siblings, cooking and cleaning, and overseeing online schooling. And it was only when this issue kind of emerged in the context of my gender and politics class that students kind of realised that this was something that wasn't just invisible labour, it was something that was significant, and it was the kind of thing that, you know, universities needed to recognise as well. So I think that there's, you know, in the school as a site of depletion, we can also extend it to think about the university as a site of depletion as well. So I've got 2 minutes. Okay, well I think I'll skip over some of this then. I think one of the things that I want to kind of reflect upon then in my comments is around the kind of limitations of the depletion framework. And I think you talked about this in your comments in relation to the ongoing conflict in Palestine, about how, you know, when life itself is being eradicated, how can we even think about this in terms of depletion frameworks? And, you know, I think that we can kind of not just look at like the kind of most extreme cases of war and genocide, to kind of also think about where there are instances where concepts of depletion perhaps don't do enough to capture the kind of the violence of everyday life. So I was reading a really interesting paper in Review of International Political Economy by Fernandez and Athukarola, who have done a really interesting study of the life-making strategies of Ethiopian refugees in Kenya, who have, as they put it, have been pushed to precarity. And the article kind of charts all of the different ways in which the kind of the marginalisation of refugee populations, the ways in which they are kind of treated by police and other people in positions of authority, and the ongoing kind of violence that they face on an everyday basis. And they talk about this as an attack on social reproduction, and they see depletion as relevant to this, but not doing enough to capture the absolute violence of everyday life. So I guess my question for you is, where do you see the limits of the depletion framework? Are there limits to thinking about social reproduction in relation to depletion? And at what point does depletion tip into the very tangible violence of the attack on social reproduction?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Shirin, for writing the book and launching it here with us.
Yes.
A very inspiring and generative book. And it helps us understand the conditions of work that sustains lives in contemporary capitalism. Its cumulative and anticipatory effects captured through the concept of harm and how you deploy it. And its global reach, touching down in places as diverse as Coventry, New Delhi, and Eastern Cape in South Africa. And I'm really quite lucky that Diane has focused on chapter 2 and the methodological discussions, and Juanita brought in the chapters on childcare in Coventry and what's going on with the depletion of social reproduction in New Delhi. I'd like to note 3 different strands of what I take from the book that resonate with me, both as a researcher as well as a person, as a personal person, but not a political person. And I think the book really is especially valuable for thinking about contemporary global capital and about contemporary capitalist state and about contemporary social struggles in and against the capital and in against the capitalist state. And so the 3 strands that come out from the book really well for me is your methodological richness and engagement, your analytical register of both material and discursive processes, as well as the practicalities and politics of how we approach depletion. And so methodologically, you have such a diverse and complementary tool set that you deploy in the book. And you really do foster a conversation between the numbers person, the stories person, and the discourse person. So there's space at the table for this discourse person as well. And you do that most prominently in the chapter 2 on measuring depletion that Diane already talked about, how you measure depletion in multiple registers. And I think their time is that key resource worth struggling over. And time use surveys come in the problematic but also helpful ways. They are there to make visible which is concealed, overlooked, or strategically silenced, as Isabella Bakker has drawn our attention to. They also help us to impute some value to labor that is not typically valued, but they do not capture the social processes that explain why certain types of labor and why certain types of laborers are more or less valued. And that's the work that you, Diane, have done on Marx and value quite some time ago. So you take the limits of these methods, and in the developing of the Feminist Everyday Observatory tool, which is then shown to us through a narrative ethnography in the chapters in the study that's conducted in New Delhi, and to some extent with children in Coventry. But it was the last substantive chapter in the book that really resonated with me the most, and that was my favorite chapter in this book, Postcards to the Future,
anticipatory harms and struggles against extractivism. And that chapter really delves into the analysis of a campaign of the Amadiba people in South Africa. And that's a community that struggles against a mining company, and that mining company is keen to extract titanium from the community's land. And they also struggle against the government of South Africa, the government that's in charge of granting licenses that allow for this mineral extraction to take place. And so Postcards to the Future draws also on a range of legal literature and methodologies, and complements it with a visual and narrative cultures that, for which you use the photographs and postcards by Tom Pierce. And that's a series of critical photographs titled Postcards from Holobeni. And this mixed methodology in that chapter in particular, I found that it allows you to capture the social history of the place and its people, their culture and their values, their political commitments and their activities, their legal struggle, and the cost that they bear for realizing these legal struggles, political commitments and activities. Their gender and intergenerational relations come through that chapter, their emotions, their place in the global regime of accumulation of capital, and their alternative visions for themselves and for their community. In other words, this chapter beautifully brings together structural forces and subjectivities in ways that keep power and politics center stage. What else can a girl ask for? And so the second point that I wanted to make is on the material and the discursive register that you bring together. And Juanita especially talked about some of the material aspects of it. And we find through reading the book both relatability and affinity with the people that you are working with, whether it's through watching the Grey's Anatomy or organizing meetup with friends through WhatsApp groups, or getting home late after a long day at work, negotiating various forms of transportation. We also see distance across the divides of class, caste, age, gender, race, physical and mental health status. And these all mark the participants in the book in ways that differentiate them from each other, but also marks us in a position to these participants. So the reader feels both affinity and distance. And so here I just would want to prompt the audience towards the book, chapters 4, 5, 6, 4, 5, before I move to chapter 6. The discursive aspect that you weave throughout the book points to how the discursive constructions matter. They matter for ill-being, for well-being of individuals and groups. And you draw attention to the neoliberal discourse in particular that conceals the depletion of social reproduction, which is harmful. It is harmful because the reality is that people experience precarity and depletion, but that is not registered. This is silenced by the calls to self-provisioning, self-responsibilizing, self-care, engagement with children, with schools, with communities, questions or imperative to empowerment, to resilience, are all those that bring this discourses of the self right to the center of the book. And then you have another important and poignant example of discursive contribution is your conceptualization of anticipatory harm. And that's what I found very important to engage with, how talking about depletion is necessary to talk about what it is that we're experiencing today, but also the experience of depletion in the future and the struggle for the not yet real that connects individuals and households and communities. And you paint a picture of how we struggle against the unsustainable future for the future that is sustainable. And in your own beautiful words, you say that this futuristic or anticipatory harm is a narrative about the importance of communities in protecting their environment, its struggles as social reproductive struggles, keeping alive not only the physical lives of its members, but also the land on which they live and their traditions, and indeed the future generations. It is a story of a struggle for replenishment, of holding the state accountable, of developing a politics of solidarity among the communities, and also a vision of transformation, of an insistence on a different way of life. And that takes me to the final block, which is the practicalities and politics that you bring and that are the backbone of the book. And I think in my reading also the key motivation for writing for the book's materialization. And I think I have a short quote again, and you say, "I am struck by the length of time since the work on care, social reproductive work, revealed the deep inequalities of our societies, and by how little has changed to radically address this issue. My concern is with the active overlooking, unhearing, non-recognition of social relations of care, the active non-recognition or ignorance by the state and capital, or recognition in the margins, which does not fundamentally shift the boundaries of production and reproduction." And that brings me to my question, Shirin. You argue, and I agree, that we need to focus on extractive capitalism and its relationship with the state on the one hand, but also pay attention to the struggles of the affected communities and people on the other. And so you show how depletion and depletion as capitalist social relations are implicated in the everyday as exploitative, foundational, and violent. And throughout the book, you are careful not to paint the state as neither the friend nor the foe, right? And you bring in references to the in and against the state politics that have preoccupied us for several decades now. And so my question is about the capitalist state. And the capitalist state is the only state that I know today. Can the capitalist state bear the cost of valuation and bring the reversal of depletion and its attendant present and future harms? So that really goes back to the long-standing discussion of, if not revolution, then reform, but if reform, then what kind? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, let me also join the others to first congratulate Shirin for this very timely and important launch of the book Depletion. I think it is a very expansive treatment of the topic, spanning the human and the non-human or the ecological. And the book, as you have heard, framed depletion as both personal and planetary harms. So I had the privilege of reading the book over summer, and I must say that I really enjoyed the visceral quality of the writing, which I think in many ways speaks to Shirin's deep connections with the subject matter and also with the lives of the people who have participated in the various research projects that have made up the book. Since I will be wearing more of my hat as an FC fellow today, I hope to draw some critical reflections and key takeaways on the book based on my own location of being in this overlapping space of policy and academic research, having done some policy work on time use and unpaid care in the context of Malaysia, and in my academic research right now, which I reference a lot of the work of the speakers on this panel, I have also moved away from care to social reproduction as a theoretical framework to understand the Malaysian political economy. So I think the first thing I want to say is that I really appreciate the very nuanced methodological discussion on time use surveys and household satellite accounts, where Shirin has acknowledged the limitations of these quantitative methods as emancipatory tools, but at the same time not really discarding them as their potential to actually measure care and also give recognition to care labor in national accounting systems. In particular, I find Shirin's call for more theoretical engagements with time use methods a much needed methodological intervention, which has certainly resonated with my own experience with how time use has often been used rather descriptively and factually in the policy realm without sufficient engagement with theory, nor accounting for the kind of texture and rhythms and the affective and emotional registers of the everyday. And I think it is here that I think the family's everyday observatory tool, or FEOT, F-E-O-T, is a very novel and important methodological contribution. On the one hand, FEOT puts forward a version of time use that is certainly more implementable in the global south, where many countries, including Malaysia, have not actually committed to having a national time use survey. So relying on national time use as a research agenda and as a mode of producing knowledge and understanding on care, as valuable as it is, I think will still result in some kind of structural disadvantage for Global South and Global South researchers. So in the sense that the statistical infrastructure to support this kind of research has not really been laid out. On the other hand, using FEOT is also not merely a backup option, articulated in the book as a method that combines shadowing or observations with time use to precisely address the point of the lack of theoretical engagements in time use analysis. And for me, I think this has the potential of resituating the analytics of time within the kind of structural relationships between production and social reproduction, and further draws out the textured rhythms of everyday life, as seen in the unraveling of Shirin's book. I must also add that I really also like the visual analysis of the photographs by Tom Pierce, and I think that this way of bringing in the artwork of a critical photographer in academic scholarship really poses a challenge to the hegemony of the written text as a mode of knowledge production, and adds a layer to the observe in the observatory tool. So for me, that is a very welcome methodological innovation in the book. And so this is to say that I am personally very excited about FEOT when I read it in the book, and I'm certainly keen to explore, to see how I can extend and adapt this in my own future research projects as well. The second area that I want to touch on is that there are also many points of theoretical and empirical reflections in the book that push the boundaries of how we think about care. And for me, I think one of the running themes across the book that has really helped to clarify my own thinking is that despite state interventions, or maybe because of the lack of state interventions, the role of family and kinship remains central as a strategy to reverse depletion. But I think in the kind of academic and policy interface that I find myself in, I think so much of the policy discourse and the research agendas have been shaped around state actions, but disproportionately less on trying to understand and unpack everyday family dynamics. So in this sense, I also agree with Juanita. The chapter on children who care really stands out for me in terms of demonstrating how a thoughtful examination of care within the family can help to decenter a Western model of childhood and child labor, and perhaps more broadly, decenter the normative idea of a family. So building on this decentering endeavor in the book, I think there is scope to extend the social reproductive labor of children to an array of alternative family formations in which children are embedded, children and children's labor are embedded, and also interrogate how birth order, siblingship, sexuality, gender, and kin status mediate the distribution and movement of children's care labor across kinship networks for the purposes of household reproduction, and how that shapes differentiated experiences of depletion. The book further unsettles the spatiality and temporality of depletion, foregrounding the gendered act of commuting or travel as a form of liminal labor. So Shirin brings out the date time between our points of origin and destination as this moving site of regeneration, but more often than not also of depletion. Shirin calls this depletion on the move, enriching my own conceptualization of carrying on the move, which I've used to depict the social reproduction strategies of female home-based workers in Malaysia, who have to navigate time demands that are often multiple and overlapping. But I think more specifically in unraveling depletion on the move as something concealed within economic development, I think the book has provoked me to think more critically about a range of policies associated with movements and space, but often not thought of as care policies. So things like urban design, transportation systems, industrial policy, development planning. So all these supposed gender-neutral, technocratic solutions offered by policymakers without taking into consideration social reproductive reconfigurations and their wider depleting effects. Third, and this is my final point before I ask my questions, I think while the book has not anticipated the destruction of life and social reproductive capacities in Gaza, in Palestine, which was noted when it was written, a violence that we now see is extending to Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East. I think Shirin's political commitment to the commoning of social reproduction, transformative world-making, and feminist-informed anti-capitalist imaginaries in the book is indeed very clear. Shirin's articulation of social reproductive labour as inclusive of the labour involved in the struggle and solidarity to maintain life and to help it flourish, I think provides a grammar to describe the community and solidarity labour involved in sustaining student encampments in more recent times. This includes the LSE Solidarity Encampment, which took place right inside this building a few months back, where students have actually renamed this as the Marshall Bloom Building. So viewed from the lens of depletion, communities have actually responded to student call-outs for food, water, camp supplies, and other forms of welfare and life-making support to mitigate and replenish the depletion that students face when they were leading the transformative charge of demanding universities to end their complicities in the violence, scholasticide, and genocide unfolding in Palestine. Now, within this very comprehensive, nuanced, and thought-provoking research in the book, I just have two questions which are really more as like curiosity on my part rather than something that you have not addressed in your book or in your broader intellectual work. I think my first question is this. In thinking about mitigation, replenishment, and transformation as strategies to reverse depletion, I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more to how these prefigurative imaginings at the individual, household, and community levels link up with institutional configurations at the international level, which may be needed to transcend the state in addressing cross-border issues like global care chains, lopsided distribution of capital and finance, or simply the colonial imperial character of the global economy, reliant on extractions of productive and social reproductive labor, land, and resources from the global south. My second question is since you have mapped the human and the ecological cost of caring quite closely in the book, where you have shown how anticipatory harms, while focused on gendered bodies, have these kind of wider ecological consequences, I am just wondering why you have decided to go with the term human cost of caring in the subtitle of the book and not use a term that is perhaps more reflective of the not so anthropocentric ambition and scope of your project. Thank you.
Okay, wow, I don't know about you, but I'm just Okay, thank you so much to the wonderful panelists for really laying out the beautiful, broad, and complex landscape of the book out for all of us to, to get a little glimpse of, and also, of course, its important interventions. Okay, so I'm going to be a little bit of an autocratic chair here. Okay, so I did promise you, Shirin, that you have a comeback on all the 6 questions that you have been asked, including whether there is any capacity for the capitalist state to bring about reversal of depletion. I like it. I'm just sort of saying that these questions are absolutely. I mean, I think we need a seminar on each one of them. And so what I'm going to do, because also we have an audience who's been waiting to hear from me, so what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to, you're incredibly skilled at all this, so what you'll do, I know what you'll do, is that you'll just fold in the answers as you respond to the questions from the audience. So I'm going to actually now, I'm looking at you, now that my glasses on, I can see each one of you. So I'm looking at you for questions for Shirin, please. So this is your time. I'm going to collect questions in the interest of getting as many as in. So I'm going to take a round of 4. So if I can just see, any indication from you, which could be your hand up, you're trying to nod at me, you're trying to, yes, so that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking for indications of questions at this stage. As I said, okay, so I see 2 and I see 3, and I'm going to look for 1 more. Sorry, can I see 1 question? Sorry, was it? So I've got 3 now, and I really, like I said, time's ticking, so you need to tell me. So,
There's 1 now.
yeah, so I got that. So that's 1, and that's 2. You really want to get it? Okay. 1, 3, and then 4. So I do have 4 questions. So can I please very quickly ask you to say who you are, not existential discussion, just simply very quickly who you are, and your question through Shirin, please, and as brief as you possibly can. Thank you very much.
Hello, thanks for a really fascinating evening. I'm just wondering about sort of your thoughts and reflections on how we involve people who are depleted in research and how we do that ethically. And so, for example, you know, I could be involved in a time use survey and be very depleted and be logging what I was doing in this moment and the 3 different things that I was juggling at that time. But doing that is maybe not sustaining, it's not generative, it's not creative. And so I was wondering if you have thoughts on how to involve people in these replenishing ways in research.
Thank you. And I didn't get your name.
Oh, it's Ania Alexander from the Methodology Department.
Excellent. And there's a question right there. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, thank you for the lecture. My name is Lucia, I'm from the Gender and Human Rights program, sorry. English is not my first language, so I'm gonna try, bear with me. I was wondering about, like, for example, if you have addressed in the book about the hired labor, the service labor to take on care work, and the difference between the northern practices and the south practices. So, for example, here it's actually quite expensive to hire that kind of labor, so they either use a migrant population to do that, and in the south it's much cheaper, so you can be even lower middle class and get to pay for that. But what about the gender relationships that are built with those conditions? I was wondering about that.
Thank you. Gloria.
Thank you very much. And thank you for this book. I feel like we spent about a decade or so writing about all of these things, yourself included, and then you come and you write a book that makes everything clear and organized, and we can sort our own thoughts and teach. So very much looking forward to this book being out in the world. My question was kind of going towards Ania's direction, so apologies in advance, I guess. In relation to this depletion, and we have Membe who's talking about this destruction of brutalism, because I guess that's the problem with post-structuralists, they don't name material issues, but if we presume that that's capitalist system and that it is going towards very different forms of destruction of any forms of conditions for life, and we recognize, as Ania was saying, that the only state we know is that the capitalist state. And then in terms of the strategies for challenging that, you said dealing with the state, but do we then eventually, going forward, are we still thinking through the state-led or kind of within the state, or maybe kind of, I'm thinking of Lino Some's work of going against care economies and thinking about economies of care. So I guess the super broad question would be, what would it look like to fully re-examine, and you mentioned Jason Moore, sort of the strategies for fundamentally reorganizing ways in which we function as society. So what does that look like? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And your question, Choong.
Yeah, to be transparent, I am Shirin, my son. Doesn't mean that we always agree on things, and very often we won't, but I have grown up most of my life hearing about the importance of including unpaid care into GDP statistics. So I'd probably like you to respond, Shirin, Professor to Diane's kind of developing an understanding at the start around what she thinks might not be the most appropriate way to do that.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, so I'm going to come back for another round, so this is your chance to collect thoughts in your head. Shirin, yes please, you've got 4 questions, and you could fold in one on the capitalist state.
Yeah, wow. Okay, I'll try my best. I'll start with the methodology question, not because it's less complicated. No, it's very complicated, but I think it's also really important. And on the question of GDP that Diane raised, there's an ongoing debate about whether we should be focused on including social reproductive labor in the GDP or not. And Diane raised the question of household satellite account, and my problem with that is not the kind of granularity that we get from that. My problem is that it's satellite. In 2008, the UN was going to have a conversation about including what the environmental statisticians and campaigners had been arguing for, which is not to expand or not to increase GDP by including social reproductive work, but to debit environmental depletion. And then the financial crisis came. And that conversation just went off agenda and it has never come back. So there is a sense in which the way I treat it in the book and in chapter 2, as Diane said, is all these methodologies are needed. I'm not rejecting, and I think Christopher, you were very clear about that, I'm not rejecting any of these because I think we need a bundle of strategies, bundle of methodologies to come up with new ways of thinking. When I started talking, I was just going to do a pilot of time use in Delhi, actually. And I thought, okay, I want to do a cross-class analysis because, and I've come back to your question, like how can I talk about depletion in the context of upper-class women who have got access to other women's labor, right? But I wanted to open that box. And when I started to do that, I thought, I'll do a time use survey, just 8 women across class, and I'll get an idea of what I need to do for a bigger study. And what I came across was that class matters in terms of methodological unfolding. So upper class women couldn't be bothered. They said, we don't want to do all this time use nonsense. You know, we don't have time. And the domestic worker who I worked with, she was not confident to do that. And also, she was so stretched in time, which comes to your question, which is, I am increasingly, and I think Ania picked up on it, I'm increasingly uncomfortable by constant demands that we make as researchers on people. To bring more evidence to the state, to the international community, to NGOs, to sort of corporations, or we'll be really good corporate social responsibility, but let's have more evidence. Or if we bring more evidence, it's not good enough evidence. It is not, the study is not big enough, or it is not, affective. Ideas are not being picked up. We don't know how they feel. So everything that we do makes demands on us as researchers, but then we make demands constantly on those we research. And that is what upset me most about this thing. And I thought, okay, I did buy-in labor, so I was mitigating their stress by buying in labor of a research assistant, Pooja, who was wonderful. So if you read the book, you will see she's absolutely a lovely person. But in the middle of her work, she wrote to me. She said, Shirin, I love this work, but I'm so tired. It is so stressful. And the same thing happened with our ex-colleague Jayanti Lingam and Mel Johnson, who did work on 2 sites, Sri Lanka and Myanmar, both about violence, right? And this was about sort of, the intensification of depletion under conditions of intensified violence. And they came up with such beautiful, granular, sophisticated material for us and for themselves. I mean, they've written a wonderful article in, is it in Rive or, no, RIS. No, it's in Antipodes, is it? Antipodes. So check it out, Jayanti Lingam and Mel Johnson. They did a beautiful study. But they were exhausted, and the people they were talking to were exhausted. So that brings me to the question of violence. Some violence and depletion is structural, which is Pooja getting paid to do that work, and not, that doesn't offset her depletion, right? She was exhausted at the end of it. Exhaustion also of our research participants. Mira, one of the ones I talk about in the chapter on commuting, she climbs over a really high fence every day so that she can sort of have a shorter journey of 10 minutes because she has to go back and pick up her kids and then. So I think this demand, which I feel like sort of, it's structural ignorance. We really need to, as a collective, think about it, as feminist researchers think about that. So time use is important. Nobody's saying time use is not important. Making sure that GDP reflects our worlds better, both by debiting certain things, costs of social reproductive labor, depletion, as well as including things so that our relationship with the state and as citizens does not get depleted. All those things are needed, not one or the other. And that's what I found in the chapter on the environment, which I know you are most interested in, Choong, which was about, about how these postcards made me think so much about not just harm that is being done to people now, and what sort of, Joanna Conahan has called the ripple effects of harm. So, but it also meant that it was, they anticipated future harms, and they were depleted. So I think reading in multiple registers, just as we do in our everyday life. When we walk out, we don't just think of number of steps we are doing. I try never to think about that, because I always fail. But we also think about the smells that we smell, the graffiti we see on the walls, we think about the crowdedness of the pavements, etc. So we live in multiple registers, and I think that's what I was trying to capture. So that brings me to the limit of depletion framework that Juanita raised. And I wouldn't call it limits. I would call it, well, no framework. And we know the problems of having a totalistic framework, right? Let's not go there again. So neither is social reproduction nor depletion a kind of a totalizing framework. But I think, as I said in my remarks as well, it is really, really painful for me just now, as it is for, I hope, most of us here, to think about what is happening in terms of the destruction of life and limb, and also anticipating how future mental health, can you imagine living through what people are living through just now? So I did raise this issue with a colleague of mine, who's a colleague of Juanita's, Nicola, and she said she's still using the depletion framework because she's seeing it as an intensification of depletion. Because I was saying, I can't think that depletion will capture this. This is not. So we can talk about it, we can think about it, but I think there is sort of, I'm not making a claim for it as a totalizing thing. If there are conditions that appear which it doesn't end up capturing, then so be it, and we need to be open about it, and sort of, so that was one thing. And finally, capitalism. Capitalist structures, state, what do you do? I've always, and I think that's where Juanita and my work, we kind of sat down and thought, okay, we really need to say, there's obviously this whole literature on the everyday, but what do we mean by it, right? As a feminist, what do we mean by it? And I just feel that one of the ways in which I've dealt with, and actually Ruth Pearson there, she told me after the paper was written and published that, you don't talk enough about the state. And so I was thinking actually that I've always taken in my work, the approach that Ania sort of pointed to, which is in and against the state, right? We have to work with the state because our everyday worlds are so enmeshed in state policies, in state infrastructures, in state violence, So one of the first pieces I wrote about the state was about sort of women again in New Delhi fighting for their right to livelihood. And one of the issues for them was precisely that the violence of certain institutions of the state, the police, was mitigated, not transformed, but was mitigated by their appeal to the Supreme Court of India and bringing on what we call in India public interest litigation. So they took their case to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said to them, okay, we'll give you right to trade from this street, but you have to prove that you have been trading off this street for 10 years. And that's when I realized, the importance of documents, what Latour, Foucault, etc. They might talk about it, it's all there. We know about passports and birth certificates and sort of, credit notes, etc. And these women, out of the 32 I interviewed, 30 could produce for the judge fines that they had been issued by the police. And they say, here, 10 years ago I was trading here, and the court gave me a fine. And here is the change. And I asked them, why? And they said, we can't read very well, but we know that one day these things will be important, because we are so vulnerable to the state. So the state comes in our lives in very many different ways, and I am not going to stand here and say, these are the policies of replenishment which will lead to transformation. I think that's for us to do, but as you saw in chapter 6, mobilizing for change can also be depleting. So yes, I think it was Gloria who said, we do need to think about transformation, but my PhD was in China. And I know that the Chinese Communist Party tried a total transformation of social reproduction by having communal care regimes. Didn't go anywhere. Now, does that mean that they won't? No, of course not. We have to think that through, just like our kind of marginalization of race, sexuality has led to some really important questions for feminism or blacks now, I feel. So I think I'm not going to stand here and say, oh, this is my sort of, map of transformative politics, but I hope that the bundle of kind of transformative struggles that we can come up with in different contexts can help towards that.
Thank you very much, Shirin. Thank you very much for folding in many of the questions. There's still one outstanding one. Christopher, I haven't forgotten your question. We'll come back to you on that one. Okay, so we've got about, yes, right. We've got about 8 minutes, okay? 8 minutes. And I'm going to take another round. So, like before, yes, I see one, so I just need to see you. So you need to do anything you can to make yourself visible to me. So I see us, so I see one question, and I'm going to collect them because that's the most efficient way of doing this. So I see yes, so I see again in the same row as us, yes, so I see another question, so that's 2. And is there anybody else who would like to jump in and ask? Oh yes, so I see a question right there, Melina. So there's a question, so that's 3, and then 4. There is one going, and if you don't get in now, oh, there you are. Okay, so there is your question. Thank you very much. And then another question from Christopher, which I think is really quite, was an important question for, given the kinds of questions of individual and collective responsibilities that we raised here. The question between, that question of individual and being complicit in individual and also structural violence. But also, how do one's individual prefigurative imaginaries then link up with colonial, imperialist, extractivist, institutional commitments and requirements, and then what does one do being caught up in that volatile situation? So yes, please. So that question. But okay. So Asia 1, then the same row 2, Melina 3, and then yourself 4. Yeah. Yes, please.
Hi Shirin, thanks very much for sharing your work. I just wanted to ask a bit more about this tension that I see in the concept of depletion, which I think is a productive tension between the everyday and the exceptional. And I think you've spoken about it in various ways already. So you've talked about the woman jumping over the fence, you also write about the woman who travels on the metro and arrives in the office not feeling fresh, but then on the other kind of extreme end, you're talking about violence and destruction. I'm just interested in hearing a bit more about how you see this concept moving across that continuum between the everyday and the exceptional. Do you see this as different registers of depletion? So just a bit more about that. Thank you.
And Asia is, of course, assistant professor in gender development and globalization.
Hi, I'm Stella, a former student from the department. I was on the Gender and Sexuality program. And a lot of what you're talking about made me think about some of the work that we looked at from crip theory and disability rights activism in terms of care and capacity, and also some work from Hill Melitino, who talks about trans care and care within different alternative kinship networks. It didn't really engage with social reproductive theory or in a very practical sense, but I'm curious about how you see that strand of work on care interacting with your work and how they might speak to each other, and if they can.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, Melina.
Hi, hello, it's been really just such a big pleasure to see this panel. I was telling a friend that it's like seeing my biography sitting all together. I really look forward to reading the volume. And I was hoping to ask, jumping on Ania's intervention on that chapter on the Ahmadiyya's struggle against mining extractivism, I was curious about how you articulate social reproduction through depletion and your understanding of environmental depletion together.
Thank you, and yes.
Hi, my name is Leah. I'm a master's student studying gender, peace and security. Forgive me if this isn't articulated well, started 3 days ago. My question is really about affect. I mean, as we know, the patriarchal and capitalist world order operates as firmly in the home as it does in the state. And a huge part of that, particularly surrounding motherhood, is this narrative that there's a natural duty to care and to make invisible that depletion that we were talking about and emotions. So I was just wondering, through your studies with participants, how much guilt and shame appeared in the responses of the participants, because I know that the guilt of motherhood, or perhaps even caretaking more generally, is so strong in society. So I was just curious about that.
Thank you. Shirin, you have 2 minutes and 10 seconds.
I won't answer your question. We'll talk over dinner. Is that okay? Everyday and exceptional, I think that is such an important kind of formulation as well, Asia. Because I see depletion on a continuum, which is what I show in the book. And my puzzle right now, which is what I was saying, is that spectrum sort of, enough? Or is there a kind of a cut in that framework when the depletion just doesn't hold, right? And I don't have an answer to that, but I think it's a question that I want to take on seriously. So in a paper that I've just given, I was trying to figure out, well, if not depletion, then what? And would catastrophe or collapse be a better way? But actually also at the same time, Nicola Pratt, our colleague from Warwick who works on the Middle East, I mean, her approach was also quite interesting to me during the previous phase of the struggle in Gaza, which was how social reproduction is also resistance, right? And I feel a little bit of that when I think about the Kolobeni in South Africa, because they just stand there as sort of reminding us, and they think about a future that is dystopic, or it could be transformed. they are at that space where they are not sure what would happen. So they write these postcards to the state, to the minister, or to the corporation. But if you look at the images, and please go and see Tom Pierce's exhibition, it's online, it's free. It is so beautiful because they just stand there with their whole selves, in a way, to say this is us. Not this is ours, but this is us. So I think that I'm still struggling with it. Care, I wanted to say one thing sort of really about care. And Diane mentioned that it is about, my title has care in it. But I was quite insistent that it should be caring. It is labor, not the concept of care. Because and in the book, I kind of try and sort of juxtapose them and say, actually the act of caring, yes, I am completely, and care as an affective, as sort of, is all good, but caring is labor. So in that context, I do feel that there is a difference between the two, and I try and perhaps not entirely successfully try and put that in front of you. So in terms of debates around, I'll give you an example of in chapter 5, when I was talking to these children, and one of them said, I said, so one of the questions was, how many members do you have in the family? 14. What? And he was they were white, I think, 12, 13-year-old school child. And I said, 14? That's like, oh God. And of course, when he started telling us sort of, uncles, aunties, grandparents, there is a different understanding. And we know that many of us here who come from the global south, which is that the family, here's my family, it's an extended family with, which we all kind of, have a different approach to. So yes, those ideas about, and they need to, and that's why I was thinking depletion is decentering in those ways, right? So you don't have to just care about your natal family or your child. It could be, and that links to Gloria's thing, is to how do we reimagine care, but also how care is organized in our society, right? So, or caring is organized in our society. Environment, again, that is something that I'm very interested in. I'm particularly interested in how it links with questions about anticipatory harm, not just harm here and now. And that does bring to the question of human, non-human. And I did think about that, why, and in fact I actually talked about this with Kate Bedford, a professor in feminist studies or feminist legal studies in Birmingham, and we talked about why should I put in human costs of care? Because the research I have done in this is with human beings. It's not about human beings. It's obviously chapter 6 is definitely about the non-human environment in which humans live their lives. But actually we can talk about transportation. I mean, sort of, is that human? It's human relations that I was trying to get at, but maybe a bit awkwardly, right? So, and affect, yes, of course, and that is what I was trying to get at. Labor is not just done physically, right? And I was really interested to find out, what do people feel when they do some labor? And what do they feel when they are told that they are not laboring? And so one of the times, one of those 8 women in the study, she said, my husband comes back and tells me, what have you been doing all day? Why is the food not ready? That question I don't think is particularly pertinent to women in India or in Ethiopia or in Malaysia. It is everywhere, right? And the levels and the rise in domestic violence, especially post-COVID, but anyways, in this country just now, is crazy. So I think that's exactly what I was trying to get at, that these, and also relationships of extractivist relationships of labor are also affective relationships.
Thank you very much. Thank you. All our time, unfortunately, is now really up. So thank you all for that wonderful applause, and all that left is for me to thank Diane, Elson, Christopher, Ania, Juanita, and Shirin for writing the book. So thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I really enjoyed it. Absolutely, my pleasure. Yes, Armenia is my kind of co-conspirator. Yeah, we really do stuff together. Do you have to go? Yes. Armenia, I'm I just found it. Yes, she. Okay, and we're actually the same email. Email about the order.